There's a man in your city right now driving a 10-year-old Honda. He lives in a modest house in a forgettable neighborhood. He wears plain clothes, eats at ordinary restaurants, and never talks about money. Nobody at his kid's school thinks much of him. Nobody at the grocery store gives him a second glance. He's worth $47 million, and he wants it that way. This is not a story about frugality. This is not a personal finance lecture about cutting your morning coffee. What you're about to hear is something far more unsettling, far more strategic. There is a code, unwritten, unspoken, and almost completely invisible, that governs the behavior of the wealthiest people in the world. And the code says, never look like it. The question isn't why they hide it. The question is what they know that you don't. Because when you understand why the truly wealthy go quiet, everything you've been told about success, status, and money will start to feel like a carefully constructed trap. Stay with this, because before this is over, you're going to realize that the signals you've been reading your entire life, the signals that tell you who's winning and who's losing, have been wrong. Completely, deliberately wrong. There's a specific term that behavioral economists use, and it almost never makes it into mainstream conversation. They call it conspicuous consumption. The sociologist Thorstein Veblen coined it in 1899. He watched the newly rich industrialists of America and noticed something fascinating. They didn't spend money to live better. They spent money to be seen spending money. The spending itself was the product. The watch wasn't for telling time. The mansion wasn't for shelter. The carriage, and later the luxury car, wasn't for transportation. It was all a performance. A broadcast signal sent to everyone within visual range saying, I have made it. And here's what nobody tells you. That signal? It costs a fortune, not just in money, in freedom, in options, in compounding wealth that never gets a chance to compound. The people who figured this out, and they figured it out across generations and across cultures, made a different choice. They decided to disappear. We're going to talk about three things in this video that most financial channels will never touch. First, the psychological architecture behind why wealth and silence go together at the highest levels. Second, the specific, behavioral patterns of the quiet rich, not vague advice, but the actual habits, systems, and decisions they make that keep them invisible and growing. And third, and this is the part that will stay with you, the hidden cost of performing wealth. What it actually does to you financially, psychologically, and strategically over time. But before any of that, we need to go back to the beginning. Because this isn't a new phenomenon, this is ancient, and understanding where it comes from changes everything about how you see it today. The Medici family controlled Florence for generations. They funded the Renaissance. They bankrolled artists, architects, scientists, and politicians. They shaped the entire course of Western civilization. You know what they were famous for in their daily personal lives? Restraint. The family patriarch, Cosimo de' Medici, deliberately wore plain clothes, avoided public celebration of his wealth, and cultivated an image of modesty even as he controlled the financial levers of an entire city. He understood something profound. Visible wealth invites visible enemies. And at the scale he was operating, enemies were existential. Jump forward 300 years to the Rothschild family. 5 brothers, 5 cities, one of the most powerful financial networks in history. Their founding rule, documented, repeated, passed down, was that you never let the outside world know exactly how much you have. Partial information was protection. Invisibility was leverage. Jump again to the 20th century. John D. Rockefeller, once the richest man in American history, was legendarily frugal in his personal habits. He kept detailed ledgers of every penny spent. He drove used cars. He recycled paper bags. He was not performing poverty for the cameras. He genuinely believed that waste, of any kind, was a moral failure. And that discipline applied to his personal image too. He did not need your validation. He had already won. And he knew that The moment you start performing wealth, you start optimizing for the wrong thing. This is the first principle, and it's critical. The quiet rich are not hiding wealth out of shame. They are hiding it out of strategy. There is a difference, and that difference is enormous. Think about what visibility costs, not metaphorically, literally. When you buy a luxury car, you're not just spending the purchase price. You are spending the maintenance premium, the insurance premium, the depreciation curve, which on a high-end vehicle can be catastrophic in the first 3 years. You're spending the social tax, the neighbors who now expect a certain lifestyle from you, the family members who suddenly have requests, the business associates who recalibrate their expectations of what you can afford. Visibility is expensive in ways that never show up on a single line of your budget. It shows up everywhere, slowly, relentlessly. Morgan Housel, who wrote The Psychology of Money, made this point in a way that cut through the noise. He said that when you see someone driving a Lamborghini, you don't actually think about them. You think about yourself. You imagine how you would feel driving it. The car is a mirror, not a window. Nobody is looking at the driver. They're looking at the dream. And the driver spent $300,000 to be invisible inside a vehicle that makes everyone else feel something. That is the transaction. That is what you're actually buying. The quiet rich have read this playbook and closed the book. They understand that status is a game with no finish line. Every level of visible wealth simply resets the game at a higher level, with higher stakes and higher costs. The person who buys the Porsche is suddenly surrounded by people with Ferraris. The person who buys the Ferrari is surrounded by people with yachts. The person who buys the yacht is suddenly in rooms where the yacht is the poverty signal. There is no top, there is no arrival, there is only escalation, so they step off the escalator entirely. And here is where this gets psychologically interesting, because stepping off requires something most people are never taught to develop. It requires what psychologists call intrinsic identity stability, a sense of self that does not depend on external confirmation. And the data on this is damning for most of us. Research published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that individuals with lower intrinsic self-worth were significantly more likely to engage in conspicuous consumption. They were buying status because they needed it, to feel real, to feel like they existed, to feel like they had arrived. The quiet rich don't need to feel like they've arrived. They know they've arrived, and that knowledge is internal, private, and completely untouchable by anyone else's perception. But this is where everything changes. Because what I just described sounds like a personality trait, like something you either have or you don't. And, if that were true, this video would be useless. You'd either be born with this capacity for quiet confidence, or you wouldn't. But that's not what the research shows. And that's not what the behavioral patterns of the quiet rich actually reveal. What they reveal is a system. A set of deliberate, learnable behaviors that, practiced over time, rewire how you relate to money, status, and identity. If you're finding this valuable, do yourself a favor and subscribe to FinTrove right now. We go deeper than any other channel on the psychological architecture of real wealth. And this video is just the beginning. Let's talk about the specific behaviors. The actual code. The first behavior is what I call the invisibility default. Quiet, rich individuals default to the least visible option in every financial decision unless there is a specific functional reason to choose otherwise. This is not deprivation. This is not cheap. It is a deliberate filtering mechanism. They ask one question before every major purchase. Does this serve function or does it serve image? If the honest answer is image, they walk away. Not because image doesn't matter to them as human beings, but because they have learned, usually through painful early experience or through watching others crash, that optimizing for image is a zero-sum game that bleeds resources indefinitely. A study by Thomas Stanley, the researcher behind the Millionaire Next Door, found that the majority of American millionaires drove non-luxury domestic vehicles. They bought used. They negotiated price. They held their cars for years. When Stanley asked them why, the answers were not about frugality. They were about optionality. They consistently described wanting to keep their choices open, not wanting to be locked into a lifestyle that demanded constant financial performance. The car was just the most visible symbol of that philosophy, but the philosophy ran through every layer of their financial lives. The second behavior is silence as leverage. This one is subtle and it is devastating in its power. The quiet rich do not talk about money, not their income, not their investments, not their net worth, and not even their general philosophy about money in most social contexts. And this silence is not accidental. It is protective in multiple directions simultaneously. Think about what happens when you talk about money, even casually, even positively. You give information. Information is leverage. If your business partner knows your financial position, they negotiate differently. If your family knows your net worth, the dynamics shift. If your social circle knows your income, you become subject to invisible expectations and social pressure that will cost you in ways you can't fully track. The quiet rich understand that financial privacy is not paranoia. It is a structural advantage. You cannot be targeted by what others cannot see. There is a reason that the wealthiest individuals in the world, the truly generationally wealthy, are often the least publicly documented. The old money families of Europe, the founding dynasties of American industry, the private equity billionaires who operate 3 layers removed from public view. They are not invisible by accident. They are invisible by design. And that design is taught, modeled, and reinforced within those families from childhood. The third behavior, and this one breaks almost every cultural narrative we've absorbed, is spending on acquisition, not signaling. The quiet rich spend aggressively. They are not misers. They are not afraid of spending, but they direct spending toward assets that grow and away from assets that decay. They will spend enormous amounts on education, formal and informal, on health, on systems, on time, on access to information, and people that most people never even know is available to purchase. They will spend on things that are completely invisible to the outside world, because the invisible things are the ones that compound. A hedge fund manager who spends $40,000 on a private mastermind group with 12 other 8-figure operators does not look like he's spending money. He looks normal. He looks boring. But that $40,000 is likely to return multiples in deal flow, intelligence, and relationships that would never show up in a public display. Meanwhile, the person who spends $40,000 on a watch has a watch. And everyone can see the watch. And the watch will be worth less in 5 years than it is today. This is the fundamental inversion that the quiet rich have mastered. They invest in the invisible and display the ordinary. Most people do the exact opposite. They invest ordinarily and display visibly. One of those strategies builds. One of those strategies performs. Guess which one is which. The fourth behavior is what behavioral economists call deferred gratification at scale. And this goes much deeper than the famous marshmallow test. The quiet rich have restructured their relationship with time in a way that most people find genuinely difficult to comprehend. They do not think in months or quarters. They think in decades, sometimes in generations. And when your reference frame is that long, the short-term rewards of visible consumption become almost nonsensical. Consider the math. A 35-year-old who purchases a $60,000 luxury vehicle instead of investing that $60,000 at an average market return of 10% annually will have forgone $250,000 by the time they are 65. One car, 30 years, $250,000, and that's before you account for the difference in insurance, maintenance, and the behavioral effects of living inside a high-consumption identity, which research consistently shows tends to escalate over time, not stabilize. The quiet rich run these numbers obsessively, not because they are tortured by penny pinching, but because they have internalized a fundamental truth that the financial media almost never discusses directly. Every dollar you spend on signaling is a dollar that cannot compound. And compounding is, in the purest financial sense, the only game that matters over time. But wait, there is a layer beneath this that almost nobody talks about. And this is where we move from behavior into psychology, from what they do to why it works. Because understanding the mechanics without understanding the psychology will leave you with good intentions and no lasting change. Here is what the research on ultra-high net worth individuals consistently reveals. The quiet rich do not experience the same relationship with external validation that most people do. And this is not because they are emotionally cold or socially disconnected. It's because they have, over time, developed what psychologists call a locus of control that is almost entirely internal. They do not look outward to know how they're doing. They look inward, at their systems, at their numbers, at their own defined metrics of progress. This has a radical downstream effect on spending. If you don't need other people to confirm that you're successful, you don't need other people to see evidence of your success. The confirmation loop that drives most consumer behavior is simply not running in these individuals the way it runs in the rest of us. And that's not a character flaw in them, and it's not a virtue they were born with. It is a learned orientation. It develops through experience, through deliberate self-examination, and often through one specific catalyst that shows up again and again in the biographies and interviews of the quietly wealthy. The catalyst is a moment of visible failure or near failure that was directly linked to image spending. Almost universally, the quiet rich can point to a specific moment. A business that collapsed under the weight of overhead designed for appearances. A financial crisis triggered by lifestyle inflation that had quietly spiraled. A relationship that dissolved under the pressure of keeping up a performance neither party could afford. There is almost always a before and an after, and the after is the silence. Warren Buffett is the most famous example of this archetype. He lives in the same house in Omaha, Nebraska, that he bought in 1958 for $31,500. He drives a modest car. He eats at McDonald's and Dairy Queen. And this is not theater. This is not a carefully crafted public image designed to seem relatable. It is, by all accounts of people who know him personally, genuinely how he lives. He has said explicitly that he does not feel deprived by this. He feels free. He says the house gives him everything a house needs to give him. He says the car gets him where he needs to go. He is one of the wealthiest human beings who has ever lived, and the single most important financial move he has made is the one nobody talks about. He never let his lifestyle grow with his wealth. That one decision, that single structural choice, is worth more than any stock pick he has ever made, because it means that the compounding machine was never interrupted. It ran continuously, uninterrupted for decades, feeding on itself. The mansion he didn't buy compounded. The yacht he didn't buy compounded. The fleet of cars he didn't acquire compounded. Every dollar that didn't go toward the performance of wealth went back into the machine, and the machine became one of the greatest wealth generation engines in human history. This is not a coincidence. This is the code. Now we need to talk about what is happening on the other side of this equation. Because the quiet rich do not exist in a vacuum. They exist in a society that is aggressively, constantly brilliantly engineered to extract money through status competition. And understanding how that engineering works is not optional if you want to escape it. The luxury goods industry generates over $300 billion annually. That number is staggering, and the industry's entire business model is built on one psychological lever: the aspiration gap. The distance between who you are and who you could signal yourself to be with this product. Every advertisement, every influencer post, every carefully staged lifestyle image is designed to widen that gap and then offer you a purchase that promises to close it. But the gap never closes. It cannot close. Because the product is not the solution. The product is the mechanism by which the gap is maintained and monetized. Think about how luxury brands price their products. They do not price based on production cost. A luxury handbag that retails for $3,000 does not cost $3,000 to make. It costs, in most cases, a fraction of that. The additional margin is not quality. It is story. It is exclusivity. It is the psychological experience of belonging to a group that owns $3,000 handbags. You are not buying leather and stitching, you are buying identity. You are renting a version of yourself that feels more significant, more arrived, more worthy. And the dark truth is, it works. Temporarily. The research on luxury purchases and self-esteem shows a consistent pattern. There is a genuine spike in positive self-perception immediately following a status purchase. It is real. It is measurable. And it fades in weeks, sometimes days, leaving you in exactly the position you started, but with less money and a slightly higher baseline expectation for the next purchase to hit the same high. This is structural addiction. It is not a character flaw. It is the intended outcome of a system that has been refined over a century of consumer psychology research, and the quiet rich, whether they have read the academic literature or simply lived long enough to feel the cycle in their own lives, have recognized the trap and walked out of it. But here is the piece that makes this more than personal. Here is the macro lens that most people never zoom out to see. The visible display of wealth does not just cost you money, it costs you options. And options are the currency of power at the highest levels. When the world can see what you have, the world can predict what you'll do. It can anticipate your decisions. It can position against you. But when your financial reality is opaque, when nobody can tell from looking at you whether you have $100,000 or $100 million, you can move in ways that are simply unavailable to the visible player. The quiet rich negotiate from a position that the other side cannot fully map. When you're buying a business, buying real estate, or negotiating any significant transaction, and the other party does not know your financial ceiling, they cannot calibrate their ask to extract the maximum from you. They are negotiating blind, and you are not. That asymmetry of information is worth more than any individual deal premium. It is a permanent structural advantage. This is why the truly elite, not the newly wealthy, not the aspirationally wealthy, but the generationally, institutionally powerful wealthy, operate almost entirely out of sight. They don't need Forbes rankings. They don't need Instagram documentation of their lifestyle. Those are tools for people who are still proving something, and the quiet rich have nothing left to prove. Let's bring this home. Because we've been building towards something specific. A realization that should fundamentally alter how you think about the money you spend, the signals you send, and the identity you're constructing through your financial choices. The question is not, can you afford this? The question is, who are you becoming by buying this? Every financial decision is simultaneously an identity decision. When you buy the visible luxury, you are not just spending money. You are casting a vote for a version of yourself that needs external validation to feel real. You are building a life architecture that requires constant visible performance to maintain its structural integrity. And that architecture will demand more from you over time, more money, more performance, more anxiety about maintaining the appearance, because the appearance, once established, becomes a commitment. People expect it. You expect it of yourself. And falling below it will feel like failure even when the underlying financial reality is perfectly fine. The quiet rich have made a different identity decision. They have decided to build a life whose structural integrity is entirely internal. Their self-worth is anchored not in what others can see, but in what they know. Their freedom is not visible to the outside world, but it is absolute. They can move, choose, walk away, or start over at any moment, because they have never entangled their identity with their possessions. Their possessions are tools. Their wealth is a resource. Their identity is sovereign. And here is the final, almost unbearable irony of all of this. The people who look the richest in most communities are, statistically, not the wealthiest people in those communities. Thomas Stanley's research was relentless on this point. The residents of the most expensive houses in any given area, the drivers of the most visible vehicles, the wearers of the most recognizable brands, they are overwhelmingly the people with the highest incomes and the lowest net worth. They are running as fast as they can on a treadmill that is accelerating beneath them. And across town, in a modest house on a quiet street, is a person you have never thought twice about who has spent the last 30 years building something you cannot see and will never fully understand. That person woke up this morning with more freedom than most people will ever experience in their entire lives. They can say no to anything. They can afford any emergency. They can take any opportunity that presents itself without asking permission from a bank or a lender or a financial situation that has been mortgaged against appearances. They are the freest people in the room, and you can't tell by looking. The code is not a secret. It has been visible for anyone willing to look past the performance. It is discipline over display, compounding over consumption, internal certainty over external validation, optionality over signaling, invisibility over performance. The wealthiest people you know don't look wealthy. And now you understand that this is not an accident, not a coincidence, and not modesty. It is the most sophisticated financial strategy available. You've been seeing money wrong your entire life. The people you thought were winning were performing. And the people you thought were ordinary were quietly building something that cannot be taken away, cannot be taxed by social obligation, cannot be eroded by the expectations of others. The question now is simple. Which game do you want to play? If this video cracked something open for you, if you felt something shift while watching it, then you already understand what the quiet rich figured out long ago. The most valuable knowledge is the kind that most people scroll right past. Subscribe to Fintrove, because what we cover here is never surface level, and the next video is going to go somewhere even fewer people dare to look.